Hello everybody. So with the new season, there are new builds. And one of the builds I'm super excited about is this dual wielding build that's popped up because it has a couple interesting nodes. Specifically, this set, the Yorman set, gives us 20% more damage while dual wielding if your main hand is a different item type than your offhand. And it has an axe and a sword on the set, so it can automatically trigger itself. But I've only decided to use the sword, and I am deciding to use the sword as its base for reasons I will explain. But let's first talk about like the build, what inspired this build, where we started. And to do that, we have to talk about my previous build, which is a multi-strike build that I used with Forge Guard in order to be Uber Aberoth. And as you can see, it did decent damage. Like it was decently tanky. We had 4,000, like almost 4,200 health. We had a good, like pretty much crit capped, and we were doing like a decent amount of attack speed, and we were very tanky. And that build is exciting, but some of the things are not going to be viable, at least for a season start scenario. And so let's talk about that, right? One, we can't use something like Shattered Worlds and Immortal Vice because we won't have it when the season starts. So that's just not going to be possible. And then two, the core of the build, Shattered Chains, doesn't exist in its current state, right? So Shattered Chains, if you look it up, right now it gives 5% more void melee damage per second, specifically to void. So melee in general has been nerfed because it doesn't have access to Shattered Chains. So we have to get that 20% more damage from somewhere else. And I think I have it, right? And that 20% more damage is going to come from the Yorman set. This is a new set added to season 4 of Last Epoch, and it gives you 20% more damage while dual wielding if your main hand is different item type than your offhand. And we are using the set sword itself. We're not even going to, go for anything different. We're not going to try and slam it onto an exhausted sword or anything like that for reasons that we will discuss. And we're only going to run the 2-piece because the 2-piece is all we need to get that 20% more damage. The 3-piece is cool. It gives us 10% critical strike multiplier, but that's nothing crazy, right? Okay, so let's talk about what makes this so good and how it compares to the previous build. So the previous build, we have 300 flat physical damage being added to our skill, an increase of 600% increased physical damage because we are a physical skill, and then we were having 20% more damage from Shattered Chains, and then an additional 120% critical strike multiplier being added from True Sight, right? It's 300% 40% of the time, so that averages out to about 120%, right? 130 maybe. So what's important is that we are getting all those same stats in this build, right? And let's talk about how. So first off, if you look at our flat damage, we have 169 adaptive damage and 122 physical damage being added. So this gives us about 300 flat damage, which is the same as our previous build. However, we have a little bit less critical strike multiplier, right? About 40 less. But that's not reality, right? Because we have this sword, Yorman's Feast, which gives us 7% critical strike multiplier per 10 bleeds on the target, up to 200 bleeds. That means we get 140% critical strike multiplier when we have 200 bleeds. And we have Undisputed, which is giving us a ton of bleed chance on hit, alongside our Multistrike, which does, a decent amount of bleed as well. And that is giving us 5% increased physical damage for each recent melee hit against a bleeding enemy. So we can get probably something like 140% critical strike multiplier over here. So while this doesn't make up for like the full gap, this takes us almost to the same amount of crit multi as our previous build. And then because we have the 255% more increased physical damage, we're getting a lot more increases. And aside from just that, we have a ton of increased physical damage just everywhere on our build, right? So with our idols, we are going for the humble idols that give us melee damage and increased melee damage and physical penetration wherever we can. So if you look at our general, we are pretty capped on resistances. We're like pretty close. If you look at my actual build that I used to be Uber, you can see that we're also similarly capped. The new build is a little bit lower on things like poison res and cold res, but that's not too important. The places that's important are void, necrotic, and physical, and we can make up for that with the 3 extra idle slots. So that's not going to be a big issue. And this is average as well. If you go to max, we should be in a better spot, right? Okay, so comparing the two builds, we're looking pretty similar in terms of stats. We actually have a lot of damage built into our build. Since we don't need Doom, we can drop something like Siphon of Anguish, and we're getting our Leech from Baldur's Chalice, so we don't really need the Siphon of Anguish. So we get to run an Exalted Ring. And normally you would think, oh, I'm not running a Legendary Ring, like this is something that's, it's weaker, right? It's weaker. But actually, because we get to run more suffixes now, the build overall is stronger, right? We're actually getting tankier because in our previous version, we only had endurance. We didn't have health as well. And getting a 4 LP Siphon of Anguish, it's 1 in 30,000, right? It's not going to happen. Compared to a like a 3 LP it's a lot easier than a 4 LP, right? So This silver ring's probably going to be a lot better just because we get to run a lot more defenses, and there's not another like unique ring that we want to run in its place. We do have the damage penalty. If you look, we take 8% more damage just in general, whereas compared to our previous build, we have 22% reduced damage. So in general, we're a little bit squishier. The effective HP difference is about 900 HP. So if you look at our health, we're at 1,163 over here on our actual Uber build. And then on the theoretical Uber build, on average, we're at 4,400, which is, you know, not the 900. It's only like 200 more. If we look at the max amount of health we can get, it's about 4,850. So looking at that, we're like 700 more. So even at the best rolls, we're going to be a little bit squishier. And that is the penalty we run running dual wielding. So, you know, it is what it is. But we don't have things like Immortal Vice, which are big bonuses to our build that could make us significantly tankier, and Shattered Worlds that similarly makes us tankier, right? Those are just Uber Aberoth items that we won't have access to before beating it. Instead, we're going to run a good pair of Eternal Gauntlets because we do need the armor mitigation applying to damage over time. That's like super critical for us. And then Valdi's Chalice is giving us bleed chance, which is also going to give us some leech because we get physical damage over time leeched as health. And then we're going to slam on top of that crit multi. So things we care about on our build is bleed and crit, right? Those are the important things. So going through the skills, let's talk about the skills because the setup is actually very similar. In fact, if you look, we have more points in Multistrike and then just less points everywhere else. So let's talk about Multistrike. This is our main damage skill. If you look, we're taking all the same more damage with Guillotine, with Path of the Night, with Determination. So we're getting all the same amounts of damage from this skill. We do just have one less sword because we're not taking additional swords at max stacks with two-handed because we don't have access to that. We could go for Doctrine of Anvil. This would give us a similar amount of damage. We would just have about 12% less attack speed. And we are already a little bit less on attack speed, so I'm not sure if I want to do this, but it is an option. And then we have our crit strike maxed over here as well. So everything on here is the same, literally just this one node. I don't know if I'm going to keep it down here or move it up, but that's, you know, up to me. And then we have an additional point in bleed chance, which we could move to the melee attack speed if we wanted, but we do need a little bit more bleed on this build just to get the maximum amount of crit multi to make it work. Our shield throw is the same. We're pretty much just going for the more ricochets, using the ricochets to get stacks of Colossus, which gives us physical penetration and armor per stack, and then frenzy. So it's just an overall good buff for what we're doing. Healing Hands is the same, exactly the same. We probably just have one less point going into Vow of Restoration. So entirely the same. Symbols of Hope, once again the same. We literally just have one less point inside of Empowering Symbols. So all the stuff is pretty much the same, except for the fact that we have Holy Aura, where the other build had Abyssal Echoes. So we are a Paladin, which makes us a little bit better. And the reason why we're better is because we get to take Holy Aura, which gives us 50% increased physical damage, 9% attack speed, 40% increased crit chance, and then 15% critical strike multiplier alongside endurance, elemental resist, and poison resist, right? So we get a ton of useful stats to us, whereas Abyssal Echoes pretty much just gave us 20% melee attack speed and 20% increased damage, which was a nice little damage steroid, but having to interrupt your, you know, normal playstyle in order to cast Abyssal Echoes was just a downside, right? It was a little bit mana hungry, and this is like Holy Aura is an entirely passive mana benefit. So we just get all the benefits with no downside here. And then here we do have a downside for a little bit more damage, but it'll be easier to play for sure if you're going the Paladin version, which is what I am doing. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of the key points that make these builds different. Otherwise, they're going to play very similarly. And we've already tried and tested this Forge card against Uber Aberoth, and it has beaten him. So I'm like relatively confident in the skills of this Forge card to beat, or sorry, this Paladin to beat Uber Aberoth. If you look, I think we should have, yeah, where is it? Damage over time taken. Okay, it says 8%, but it's not applying our armor mitigation to damage over time. I don't know where that stat is, so I guess I'm not going to worry about it. But we have a lot of armor mitigation to damage over time. This will probably be like a 14, and this will probably be like a 20. So we'll have 34% armor mitigation applying to damage over time, which is a little bit more than what our current like Forge Guard build had. So I'm anticipating this to be pretty good. Additionally, in our belt slot, because we are running a exalted belt rather than a unique belt, it's going to be a lot easier to slam the cleanse over here, because you can just slam like a tier 1 and not worry about it, and all you need is like a double health. So if you have a tier 7 hybrid health, you're pretty much ready to start and try slamming this. You literally just need to get a to seal either a tier 1 cleanse or a tier 1 Yorman's Feast, so or Yorman's Thirst, whatever it's called. So you need either of those to be to be sealed, and then the other one you can just slam as a prefix. So the belt overall, pretty powerful, pretty easy to craft in comparison to the Shattered Chains. And overall, the item requirement of this, we're using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 exalted items and 1 set item, right? So it's going to be a lot easier to get than this Forge Guard that I had on the right, partially because the Forge Guard also required Uber items, which are hard to get in its own right. Otherwise, I made sure to keep the item requirement very similar. So a 2 LP True Sight Glass is a 1 in 112, a 2 LP Apostate Sanctuary. Let's see what this is. This is a 1 in 51, so it's going to be easier to get. A 1 LP Undisputed, because it's a 1 in 7, and then a 2 LP is 1 in 153, so it's going to be a little bit harder to get compared to a 2 LP Plague Dragon's Tongue, which was a 1 in 35, right? So if you can get a 2 LP Undisputed, obviously you want to say melee attack speed as a secondary. That would be huge in terms of damage, right? Our melee attack speed is 175%, whereas this build had 216, so it's a little bit higher because we did have that double tier 7 slammed. But if you could get the 2 LP Undisputed, that's where you'd want to go for sure. I did consider a lot of alternatives for this build because, you know, oh, I should also mention there is a prefix that's pretty interesting here, which is melee physical damage if you're wielding a sword, which we are. So we get to slam that as 2 of our prefixes on our helmet and our body armor. And that's something that we don't get on this. So we're missing some like interesting affixes basically to make this work. And then otherwise, we're going to slam a primordial multi-strike, which is giving us an extra 150% increased melee damage, specifically melee damage, which we are only doing, right? We're a melee crit build. So we're getting a ton of increases in comparison to our old build. We're like 500%, like 500% increased damage over our old build. So I think the damage on this new build is actually going to be higher by a good bit because we have a lot of similar more multipliers spread across the board. We're going to be a little squishier for a lot more damage. So this build should be uber viable. Obviously, I'm using my previous build knowledge as a caveat to sort of like draw upon this conclusion, but I think it's going to be incredibly powerful. And then we also do apply a lot of bleeds. So we do have like a 600% increase to our bleed damage, which is a dot, which doesn't get affected by armor at all. So that's also very powerful as well. Additionally, we have like, you know, our shred slammed on our amulet, but if you can't get it, prioritize the shred over the crit multi here, just because if you're looking at something like Last Epoch tools, at Tunk Labs, the first 60-ish stacks of your shred is going to be everything you need. So if you can get any source of shred, that's going to have a crazy amount of effect in comparison to not having it. So shred is more important actually on this build in comparison to the crit multi, but if you do have a 2 LP, go for the tier 7 crit multi and tier 5 armor shred. So just a couple notes about the build. And then I would be remiss if I didn't talk. I know I've talked a lot already about this build. I'm very confident in it. I'm actually super interested in playing this like dual wielding version because I don't think there's been a dual wielding build that I've had a ton of success on with Uber. The only one has been the electrified smite version of Multistrike that I played a little while ago. I think it was originated by Perry. So that one also is very Uber viable without any Uber relics, but Perry's made a video on it. I'll leave it to him. This is something that I'm pretty interested in, especially because it's using like a raw set item. So one of the reasons why we're not really using a actual, you know, exalted set over here is because if you were to run it, the affix at tier 7 has the same amount of crit multiplier per bleed, right? At 7%, that's a high roll. Here, it just has it straight up, right? You can just get it. Like that's just an implicit, right? And so looking at the stats, it's all the stats that we care about. It has like 100 flat melee damage, so that's going to scale in order to go to our melee physical, and it has melee attack speed, so it has everything we want already. And so getting an exalted of this would not really be an upgrade. I did consider a couple other things, right? Let me talk a little bit about what I've considered. I considered Legends Entwined and being able to drop either the belt or the sword, but considering that we are running the primordial affix on our multi-strike over here, and it's pretty good, what we would want to do is run the Fangs of the Berserker, which is giving us more melee damage while you have Frenzy, and increased damage taken while you have Frenzy, but it would make us even squishier essentially, and then it gives us increased Frenzy effect per strength, which we don't have a ton of strength, so it doesn't really synergize with us that well, and we take a bunch of more damage, so I'm not super inclined to go that direction. But it would open up our primordial slot if we wanted to run like a couple different things, right? Which is what we could do if we took off Champion Regalia. If we did run Legends Entwined, obviously that would be our primordial slot. We couldn't really do anything there. I also thought about Whetstone Gavel, so that is a unique mace. It's a primordial mace. Whetstone Gavel is pretty interesting because it gives you plus 90 to 100% increased effectiveness of your exalted weapon in your offhand. But I do believe that if you slam a set affix onto an exalted weapon, while I am calling it exalted, I think it counts as a set item. So I don't think it gets that 100% increased effect, but I could be wrong about that. EHG, feel free to correct me. But I believe that's how that works. Then I want to talk a little bit about Anchor of Oblivion, which is an alternative to Valdi's Chalice. So Valdi's Chalice is giving us a good amount of leech because we're getting it from our damage over time, done by our bleeds, and we will have a decent amount of bleed damage. And it's giving us more bleed stuff, but Anchor is pretty interesting because it will endurance cap us pretty easily, give us some endurance threshold, and give us a good amount of strength. So that's all like pretty interesting. And then Oblivion Wave will be released, which is a little bit of damage, but it's not something that like we should be too worried about. So we also don't care about the void damage, and it's like it's kind of hard to get as a 2LP. I think I've only ever seen it as 1, so it's not something I'm too crazy about. Whereas Valdi's Chalice, like a 2LP is pretty possible, right? You could get a 2LP and then you could figure out something you wanted to slam here instead. So you could get like a physical damage and crit multi, like 2 tier 7s. That would be very powerful, right? So that's what I'm thinking over here. I had a 2LP Army of Skin with double hybrid health. I mean, that's the same over here. So I'm not like, I think the rest of these items are very, very achievable. And I think this is the most achievable version of the build. So that's why I'm putting this out there. And I'll leave the planner in the description. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the bleed version of this build. So there is theoretically a tankier version of this build that is bleed based that I haven't tested that could be very powerful. And it uses multi-strike as well, but we're more focused on the bleeds rather than the crits. So let's talk about what makes it different, right? So more damage from skills, when it says more damage and it doesn't say like, oh, this says more melee damage. Okay, this says more damage. This is more melee. This says more damage. Okay. So this version of the build, I'm a little bit less confident in it just because I haven't really played it. But the more melee damage won't apply, right? The more melee damage won't apply. It'll be just a nice little damage buff, but we are getting the more damage from Path of the Night and the more damage from Determination in order to get a lot more damage. And then we're applying a ton of bleeds. So we have 25% bleed chance per stack. And then we have what? 1 extra stack, so we have 3 stacks. So we have 75% bleed chance just from multi-strike, and then we have 100% more damage over here, and then 60% more damage from over here. That's all applying to our bleeds, right? And so we are going to continue running Valdi's Chalice. We probably don't need crit multi anymore. I should have changed this to like physical damage, I guess. Instead, that's my bad. I'll have the corrected version there. But we are using sword catchers here, which is super important. This is a sword catchers that I had on last season as well, which is melee attack speed and physical damage. If you look as an implicit, you can have up to 190% chance to apply bleed on hit, as well as because we are an axe, when we have our 5 points into forge card, we're going to get an additional 75% chance to apply bleed on hit. And because we are Carrion of Creation, we get to transform all of our Ignite, Frostbite, Shock, Time Rot, Damned, and Poison chance into bleed, right? So that's a lot of different things. So we're going to take blessings that give us Shock, Frostbite, Poison, and Ignite. So that's an additional 400% chance to apply bleed on hit. So that's essentially an additional 4 bleeds per hit, right? And considering our multi-strike is hitting like, what, 3 stacks, 4 with this. So we're doing 4 extra swords, so 5 hits every time we use multi-strike with this build. And looking at our melee attack speed, that's like, what, 1.5 hits per second. So we're going to apply a ton of bleeds. We are running Blood of the Exile here because we want the more physical ailment damage to moving enemies and the duration. And then we are also going to get duration from our Valdi's Chalice, so it's going to be pretty good. The more damage from Apostate Sanctuary is going to apply because it's not more hit damage, it's just more damage. And then we do have Electrify chance from our Healing Hands that is going to apply onto our bleed as well. So this is going to be converted as well. And because it's a melee hit, it doesn't break, you know, our Apostate Sanctuary. And then we have more levels to multi-strike, so we don't have to commit as hard if we don't want to. So we can run a tier 7 over here, and we can run Titan Heart to give us less damage taken, and we're not dual wielding, so we will be much tankier with this version of the build. If you look, we have a similar amount of increased physical damage, so we have 1000% to dot. Obviously, we have more to melee because I haven't really removed my idols from the previous setup, but it is what it is, you know? Considering we're not void, I don't see a reason to run Shattered Chains. If you guys have good suggestions for a belt, I'm all for it, but it's pretty much the same belt, just without the sealed affix slam. And then in terms of our helmet, we have a couple different affixes. We have chance to bleed on hit while wielding an axe, and then increased physical damage and bleed duration as well, both at tier 5, because we care about health primarily, but then this is also good. You can run this if you like want to just run an exalted with either of these as like a prefix. You can do that. I just think that the Titan Heart giving us 15% less damage and then a ton of health is also valuable. And our, you know, multi-strike damage is not going to be a pushover, so there's no reason to, you know, not go for the melee damage. And then we were using a Sunwraith. It's pretty easy to get a 3LP, right? I think 3LP is 1 in 69, so it's pretty reasonable. I think anything under 1 in 75 is very reasonable to get and reasonable to expect for an Uber build. It has up to 80% chance to apply Ignite on melee hit, which is why we want it. And then on there, we're just going to slam physical damage, endurance, and health, right? All the things that we care about. So that's it. Carrying Up Creation. This is one. 2 LP is probably not reasonable. Let me remove the hybrid health from there. 2 LP is probably not reasonable. So that's going to be the build that we're talking about. It's similar amounts of HP as our previous build, a little bit tankier on average. So our max HP is going to be a lot tankier than our Forge card. So that's going to be really exciting. If you're looking at our passives, we have a couple things different as well. Because, I forgot to remove the dual wielding passives. Wow, we can have a ton of things different here, right? So if we remove all the dual wielding passives and just go down to the bare minimum for this, we get to put a ton of points into Reverence of Duality, which gives us a ton of extra health. Because we are like a bleed build that transfers, ignites, and electrifies, we want to take all the electrify and blind chance over here because that's going to be giving us more bleed chance. And then we want to go into things like penance, which gives us chance to bleed on melee hit, as well as bleed duration per endurance threshold. Wait, is it threshold? Oh, it is threshold. Yeah. And then we also get physical penetration with bleed and then increased damage over time whenever we get penance granted. So penance is whenever we get hit. And considering we're tankier, we can get hit more. So we can put more points into this, or we can put more points into the ignite chance, or, there's a lot of places. The extra points that we've removed from the Sentinel passive tree is essentially going to go back into giving us more damage. So that's another like high value place that I think is like really interesting. And then we do get up to like 6 levels of melee skills from our sword catcher. So that's like super valuable. So that's all I'm saying. I'm saying there's like a lot of potential for this bleed build that is an alternative, right? And this video has already been very long. This is 2 essentially versions of Multistrike that I think are going to be uber viable. One that I'm super excited about is the dual wielding build. This is going to be squishier, but it should have a metric butt ton of damage. And then the second, which is a little bit less squishy, like a lot tankier, but also has like probably decent damage potential, is this this sword catcher version. And I did think, for those wondering, I did think about Viscera. Let me see if I can find him. Torquefin's Hunger is what it's called, or something like that. I don't know how to say it. It gives you physical penetration with bleed, flat health, bleed on melee hit, and then Viscera, which is pretty handy for like clearing, but not like, it gives you 1 stack every 2 seconds, and then it's going to be immediately expended because you're going to use a non-channeled melee attack. So, whatever. Like that part's not going to be that interesting. But the reason why I didn't is because as a base, axes give so much bleed chance, and then you can also get more bleed chance just through like all the axe related stuff. So I think it's not that valuable. So that's why I'm deciding to run it the way it is. As a peak, you can get like 1,000 more HP than my previous build, so it can be significantly tankier is what I think. And so the resistances don't matter that much, but you should fill them out in your idle slots instead of going for the increased melee damage. Okay, thanks everybody for watching. Hopefully you guys got a couple ideas on good season 4 Uber builds. This is definitely going to be something I'm trying maybe after my Sork build. So if you guys are interested, here's a good alternative, and I'll catch y'all later. Peace.